Welcome, everyone. This event is part of Bristol Festival of Ideas Online, a series of conversations with writers and thinkers from all over the world. You can watch more from this series on the Bristol Ideas YouTube channel, and you can go to bristolideas.co.uk for more video, audio, and essays. My name is Matthew Teller, and for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be wearing two hats. I'm an interviewer, but I'm also an interviewee. The idea being that this will be a free-flowing conversation between two authors who are working in not exactly similar fields, but adjacent fields, certainly in the same part of the world, which is the Middle East, but coming from very different perspectives and very different backgrounds as well. So if this goes well, then there'll be questions and answers going in both directions. So first, let me introduce myself. I am a writer and a journalist based in the UK. I started out in travel writing. I'm the author of The Rough Guide to Jordan and several other guidebooks as well. My journalism has been published by The Guardian, The Independent, The Times, The Financial Times, The Observer, and a bunch of others. And I also produce and present documentaries for BBC Radio 4 and World Service. During lockdown in 2020, I republished some of my more recent pieces as a book, Quite Alone, Journalism from the Middle East. And the book that we're discussing today is my most recent one, which was published this year by Profile Books. I promise that it'll be the last of this parade of books, 9 Quarters of Jerusalem, which we'll get to later. So that's the starter, if you like, and now we'll get to the main course. I'm very honored today to be talking to Raja Shehadeh, who is joining from his home in Ramallah. Raja is Palestine's leading writer. He's also a lawyer, and in 1979 he co-founded the pioneering non-profit human rights organization Al-Haq, which monitors and documents human rights violations committed in Palestine and Israel. Raja's output is prolific, as well as legal reports and articles for international media. Over the last 20 years, he's published a succession of books examining his own life and the changes that he has experienced in Palestinian landscapes and Palestinian society under Israeli occupation. His 2007 book, Palestinian Walks, won the Orwell Prize. And his latest book, which we'll be discussing today, is We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I, which is newly published this year, not coincidentally, also by Profile Books. So first of all, Raja, welcome.
Thank you, Matthew, for this wonderful introduction.
The first question will be, and I imagine that we'll be asking and answering each other questions, so there'll be a Q&A sort of going to and fro between us. How did you come to write this book? And also, why did it take you so long? It's been more than 30 years since your father's death. Why did it take you so long to get to it? Perhaps also for people who don't know, you could explain what happened to your father. And also a related question, how different is this one from your 2002 book, Strangers in the House, which also deals with your relationship with your father?
Well, for a number of years, I worked with my father, Aziz Shehadeh, at the law office. And we, like all fathers and sons working together, had our times, good times and times when we fought. And then on December 2nd, 1985, I lost him at the hands of a murderer who it turns out that was an Israeli collaborator. And this, of course, was a devastating moment in my life, and it changed my life forever. And then after that, I pursued an investigation with the Israeli police, which took years and years and years without coming to any conclusion. And this was rather draining for me. And of course, I wrote about this in Strangers in the House, my 2002 memoir. And then I was so troubled with the relationship and so fed up with that subject that I wanted to move on to other writings. And I thought after I wrote Strangers in the House that it was time and I was able to move on to other writings. And at that time when I wrote Strangers in the House, I was not aware of my father's experiences and works in politics and the law. And that, even though in my father's final year in 1985, I could see that he was very busy putting together his papers in order. And these papers remained in his house for many years until my mother said, I'm fed up with having these papers in the house. Come and see which ones you want to throw away and which ones you want to keep. And after a while, I couldn't take her nagging and went to the house and picked up the whole lot and put them in my house, in my office. And they stayed there for many years, many, many years. I didn't even have the interest in looking at them. I thought I didn't want to get into my father's affairs anymore. And then during the lockdown, 32 years after his death in the COVID lockdown, I decided that I will take a look, and I discovered a treasure trove. There were documents and articles, some published, others not, of his major legal cases and examples of his courage and standing up to power. It was an amazing, amazing discovery that I found in these papers. There were, he was himself a refugee, and from 1949 to 1952, he worked very hard to implement the UN General Assembly Resolution 194 for the return of the Palestinian refugees to their homes. They were forced out during the Nakba of 1948. And there were cases of his breakthrough cases against the British Barclays Bank, which at the end of which he forced them to transfer to the Palestinian refugees funds in the bank's branches in the cities that came under Israeli jurisdiction. And as a result of this success in this case, he was rewarded by not being allowed to go back to Jordan after he was in London working on the case. And he was exiled from Jordan for 18 months. And then he was, after his return, during his time in London, he submitted a memorandum to the members of the British Parliament complaining about the torture of prisoners by the British head of the Jordanian army, John Bagot Glob. And as a result, when he came back to Jordan, he was incarcerated in the desert prison, El-Jafr, it's called El-Jafr, in the intolerable hot summer months for 2 months. And so there was, and then he was, of course, involved in the defense of those accused of the assassination of King Abdullah. He was involved in the defense of Archbishop Hilarion Capucci for gun smuggling, and the case of the Jordanian free officers who in 1957 attempted to topple the regime in Jordan. So there was so much to write about. And by 2019, I felt I was ready and had the distance to write this book. And the result is the book that we're discussing today. So having said all that, now it's my turn to turn to you, Matthew, and ask you, how long did it take you to write this book, 9 Quarters of Jerusalem? And your book is presented as history, but really it is much more about the people of the city. How did you get to know them? And what is your connection with Jerusalem?
That's very interesting. My answer is also going to talk about distance as well. I think distance from the subject, in order to be able to write about it clearly, is very important from our very different perspectives. The idea for my book started in conversations with a friend in Jerusalem, Raja Shehadeh, in 2013. And I first proposed it to a publisher some years later in 2018, and then it was about 2 years to research it and write it and get it ready. But all that time, I was very aware of centuries of people like me, white, English, middle-aged, middle-class men, in particular men as well, outsiders to the life of Jerusalem, claiming Jerusalem for themselves, or for Britain, or for the British Empire, or for Christianity, and then proceeding to tell everybody at length in print why their opinions about the Holy City matter so very, very much. That's not why I've done what I've done. The first thing I want to say is that Jerusalem is not my city, and it never will be. I'm very lucky to have been visiting Jerusalem since I was a child, 40 plus years ago. And also my story, as well as being about distance, the same as yours, my story is also about my father as well. All 8 of my great-grandparents arrived in Britain between about 1887 and 1913 from Poland and Ukraine and Belarus and Lithuania. All 8 of them were Jewish. I grew up in a Jewish household, in fact, in a Zionist household. Both my parents were Zionists, as their parents were before them. And my first visit to Israel was with my parents on a family holiday when I was 11 in 1980. And then in 1982, my father, who now lives in Israel, he's emigrated and he lives there, he arranged for me to have my bar mitzvah twice, once in the synagogue that we used at home in South London, and again at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And I've been coming back to Jerusalem all my life, traveling, living, working, visiting. The way I characterize it in my own mind is, for the first 20 years of my life from my father and my mother, I received one view, a Zionist view. For the next 20 years of my life, I went out of my way to try and listen to other perspectives. I lived in Cairo for a while. I traveled to Beirut and Damascus. I lived in Amman and other places, as well as Jerusalem. And I was listening to new ways of telling stories about Israel and about Jerusalem that I thought I knew from my childhood. So, one motivation for writing the book was, on all those visits to Jerusalem over my teens and my 20s and my 30s and my 40s, was seeing how people like me, tourists, visitors, pilgrims, would be marginalizing the people who live and work in the old city of Jerusalem, this walled area in the middle of the city where all the holy places are. I was watching people visiting, if you like, with a tick box. So people would be coming specifically in order to pray at the church, or to visit the mosque, or to touch the Western Wall. And they were regarding the people, if you like, between me and my holy place as being in the way. They were an impediment, if you like. So people who are living and working and trying to raise their kids and whatever and live their lives in this place were being sidelined and were trying to be marginalized. And none of that seemed right to me. And I thought for a long time about how to try and undermine that, to try and deconstruct that. And this book was one that was the result of that. But there, that was one motivation. There were also other motivations, which I hope hopefully we can talk to later. But I wanted to ask you as well, from your perspective, I'm an outsider, but from your perspective in Palestine as a Palestinian, what was it like for you writing your book? How did you go about it? What was your experience in writing this book?
It was a very rich experience because it made me closer to my father. And it made me realize and understand things viscerally, which I only understood rationally. So in the course of writing, I relived with my father some of the experiences that he had been through, which, as I found out, were similar and are similar to experiences that I went through. So, for example, after 1948, he was living through an experience of seeing, not only of seeing the refugees living all over Ramallah and in anywhere and empty lands, making tents and so on, but also seeing how Palestine was being divided between Israel and Jordan, and Palestine was ceasing to exist, and it was simply recreated as Jordan and as Israel, and so I have always understood that we are living in a continuing Nakba, but didn't really experience that until I started working with my father's memories and papers and trying to put myself in his shoes. So I then realized that our situations were so similar, not only in the fact that he saw Palestine being changed from Palestine into Israel and Jordan, but also in my case, I was seeing how the West Bank was changing from being a Palestinian area, previously Jordanian, but now Palestinian, how it was being changed into an Israeli area through the building of settlements. And I realized also that our reaction, both our reactions to this event was similar in that we tried to resist it through the law. He took cases in the courts and tried to resist through legal action, and I tried to resist through human rights. And so the next thought that intrigued me was, having found out how similar my experiences are with my father's, why was it that I did not admire him? Why was it that I was not so more close to him? And why was it that I never asked him about his own experiences and saw the similarity between our two experiences? And so this is a question that begins to pervade the book, and this is the question that I try to answer in the course of the book. And I wanted to ask you, Matthew, also about the title. Your title is strange because you say in the title, 9 quarters of Jerusalem. What does this title really mean? 9 quarters. We know about 4 quarters, but you say 9 quarters. What does that mean?
Yeah, there's a story there. I talked a bit before about how one motivation for writing the book was to refocus attention on the people of the old city. Another motivation was seeing, again, as an outsider, but how the reality of the old city of Jerusalem didn't match up to the maps that all the people like me, visitors and pilgrims and outsiders, were using. It's not a big place, the old city. The area inside the walls is only about 1 square kilometer. And there's about 35,000 people who live there, 90% of whom are Palestinian. And the maps that people like me were using then and are using still today show these, as you said, these 4 clearly demarcated quarters within the walls of the old city: Christian quarter, Muslim quarter, Armenian quarter, and Jewish quarter. And they show these sharp, clear lines of division between them. But as you all know, and as anybody knows who's been there, in reality, there are no dividing lines between the Christian quarter and the Muslim quarter. The line between those 2 quarters is just a street. It's a market street, and there are shops on both sides, and there are people on both sides. There aren't really both sides. It's just a street, an alleyway in the city. These quarters don't make any sense. There are churches in the Muslim quarter. There are mosques in the Jewish quarter. There are people living everywhere. This sense of exclusivity is entirely false. But I could see that people approaching Jerusalem for the first time, in particular, might imagine that these quarters are somehow holy. This is a holy city. Has it been divided into holy quarters? That's a mistake. But then from that mistake, it's a short step to the next one, which is thinking that perhaps Christians aren't even allowed into the Muslim quarter, say, or the Jews may not enter the Armenian quarter. So then you have a situation where a Christian visitor thinks that the Muslim quarter, as defined, is somehow enemy territory or something. The whole thing is mad. None of it makes any sense. Where did the idea come from? I started to do some research. Many historians have written about the 4 quarters. Salim Tamari is the most prominent. He's a Palestinian historian, as you know, who lives down the road from you, I believe, Raja.
Yeah.
And there are others as well, Michelle Campos and Roberto Mazza and Vincent Lemire. But I think I'm the first to be able to pin the creation of the 4 quarters onto one particular person. And in the course of my research, I found out this person, George Williams, who was British. He was 27 when he arrived in Jerusalem in the 1840s as chaplain to the Bishop of Jerusalem. He published a map in 1849. Maps before his did not show four quarters. His map, and just about every single map that's been made ever since, do show four quarters. So my conclusion is that George Williams at least was the instigator. He may not have created the idea, but he was the first to codify the four quarters in cartographical form. But if you look back at other sources, this idea of four quarters was imposed. It was an outside imposition. One historian, looking back at the 13th, 14th century, talks about 39 quarters of Jerusalem. Another one, Mujahid ad-Din from 1495, talks about 18 quarters in what was his home city. My point in choosing this title, apart from just having a little bit of poetry, 9 quarters of Jerusalem sounds a little bit mysterious, and it may make you query what it means, when you're looking at the titles of books, or you're browsing in a bookstore. What does 9 quarters mean? So hopefully to try and encourage a bit of curiosity. But my point was also to say that there are no more 4 quarters than there are 9. Or 12, or 17, or 31, or whatever number you choose. 4 quarters is false. And I wanted a title that said so. But now I'm going to turn the same question back to you again. As you talked about previously, your title, We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I. Why weren't you friends? Does your book, I hope that my book answers the mystery of 9 quarters of Jerusalem on the cover. I hope it explains why. Does your book explain the strange sentence on the cover?
Well, I think your book does answer the question. So I assure readers that it does. In my case, the book gives many hints at the answer to the question, but ultimately leaves it to the reader to decide for themselves. I can say that I've always wanted to be close to my father, but continued to fail. And when I learned of his successes in the blocked account cases and of his imprisonment and his bold call for peace in 1967 and all of that, I realized there was so much to admire in my father. And the question was, why did I not admire him? And why did we not grow closer? And that's the question that pervades the book. Now, one possible answer is that I took my mother's side. When my father was in prison and when my father was in exile, my mother had a hard time. She was short of money. She went around from one official to another trying to persuade them to release my father. And she was a good raconteur, and she always spoke about her troubles and how brave she was to do all of that, and how much it took out of her, and so on. And so I was very sympathetic to my mother. And of course, all the time she blamed my father. She said, "You're a risk taker, you do too much, you should leave politics," and so on. And so my position towards my father was more negative than positive. And rather than admire him for what he did, I took my mother's side. And in the end of the book, I come to say, and maybe I will read this little short
please do.
Part. As to our own relationship, I finally see how often he made attempts to bring me closer to him. How often in the course of our life together, he tried to get me to listen, but I couldn't or wouldn't, because I was angry that the unpopularity of his politics was making it difficult for me to belong, or so I thought for a long time. Now I realize, to my eternal regret, that the main reason why the love between us remained unacknowledged was me. I was the one who was unwilling. So this is the conclusion that I come up with in the book, but ultimately it's left to the reader to figure that out through the hints that are given in the book. And I'm sure different readers would have their own mind about why we were not friends and why we could not be close in his lifetime. Now, of course, my father died when he was 73 years old, and he was in good health. And had he lived longer, we could have reconciled, we could have become closer together. I could have grown up and started to realize that he was an older man and I will lose him soon and I should try and make amends before I lose him. So that opportunity was lost when he was murdered. And that's how it came. But I wanted to ask you, Matthew, since we are speaking at a festival of ideas, was there a key central idea that drove you to write this book, Nine Portals of Jerusalem? At one point, you say that you wrote the book to address the imbalance in stories that exist in English-speaking culture about Jerusalem. Can you explain what you mean by this? And can you introduce us to many of Jerusalem's marginalized communities? Can you talk a little bit about them?
Yes, I can. Yes, I suppose there was a key central idea. You talked about that. There's a line in the book about addressing an imbalance in stories. Balance and imbalance are tricky words. We hear about balance most often in relation to the news media. And it has this image of a seesaw. It implies there are two sides. And in this case, there's an Israeli side, which is often conflated with being Jewish, and there's a Palestinian side. The wisdom runs if you devote equal resources to both sides, you will have achieved balance. You know, the seesaw will be level. But as I set out to try and show in the book, Jerusalem has many, many more sides than two. It's terribly misleading to reduce Jerusalem to two sides. And this idea of two sides and ideas about them being irreconcilable as well are a fiction. Any balance that might result from treating these two sides equally will never be an equitable balance. Israel has the overwhelmingly larger proportion of resources, assets, status, influence, visibility. The seesaw, if you like, is not level to begin with. So in order to achieve an equitable balance, one must act unequally. So in the book, I deliberately didn't take equal numbers of stories about Jewish people and Jewish Jerusalem and about everybody else. The book favors those who begin with fewer advantages. You know, I'm choosing to amplify the voices of the unlistened to. So as part of that, as you talked about marginalized communities, I spent some time, I won't go through the whole book, but I'll pick like two or three. I spent some time with people at the Indian hospice. Jerusalem has many, many of these hospices, and hospice in this context means a Muslim religious institution specifically related to Sufism, to Islamic mysticism. And the Indian hospices, I found it a fascinating place. It commemorates a legendary visit to Jerusalem 800 years ago by Baba Farid, who is one of India's most celebrated mystics. And his tomb is visited in India, is visited by millions and millions of people each year. And there are continuous concerts of devotional music. He's supposed to have come to Jerusalem and meditated there for 40 days. There is still a cave and a small mosque at that point within what is now the compound of the Indian hospice, which is now home to a little cluster of Indian Palestinian families, or rather, it's one extended Indian Palestinian family. Just nearby, there's a community of Dom people. Jerusalem's Dom self-identify as gypsies. And the word gypsy has a troubled history in English. It was invented sometime around the 15th century because English people thought that the newcomers who were arriving came from Egypt. So they dubbed them gypsies as a truncation of Egyptian. They weren't coming from Egypt, of course, and over the years, gypsy has acquired these pejorative connotations in English. But in English, the Dom of Jerusalem choose to self-identify with the word gypsy, so I'm following their lead. And learning about their history was also fascinating. It begins with these waves of migration out of India, not Egypt, roughly 1,500 years ago. Some people on these great movements settled in Armenia and the Caucasus region, and they're now the Lom people. Some carried on into southern and southeastern Europe, and then on into northern and western Europe, and they are the Rom or the Roma. And some settled in the Arab lands of what we now call the Middle East, and they are the Dom. And the Lom and the Rom and the Dom all share this common cultural heritage. And the Dom people have lived inside the walls of Jerusalem for 200 years or more. They experience terrible racism and discrimination from both Israelis and also Palestinians. They identify as neither. They occupy this tiny space between these two communities. I was very lucky to talk to a lady who's been working among the Dom, building community support networks for 20 years or more, Amun Slim. And she runs language courses for women, vocational training courses. She puts Dom children through after-school tutoring to try and improve prospects and opportunities for her community. Talking of racism and discrimination as well, there's another group, the African Palestinians. There's a center of African settlement in Jerusalem, right at the gates of Al-Aqsa. There's a community of around 450 Muslim people who have origins in several different areas of West Africa and Central Africa. They also experience racism, but unlike the Dom, the African Palestinians are increasingly accepted in Palestinian society, particularly because many people from that community have dedicated themselves to Palestinian national resistance, and many have been jailed. They've suffered a great deal, but they have won a certain degree of acceptance because of that. And while I was doing this research as well, all of this sort of served to reinforce for me that if, especially as an outsider, if your history of Jerusalem doesn't include Black history, Gypsy history, Indian history, or, in its very broadest sense, Arab history, then you're not telling the whole story of the city. There are many, many other marginalized communities as well who I talked to, and some appear in the book. But I also want to put up a question back to you again. I want to talk about a key element for you in the latter part of your book. You've hinted at it in some of the answers that you've given through this talk, but there's a plan that your father developed after the war of 1967 to establish a Palestinian state. First, could you outline what that plan was? But now, since there's more than 50 years has passed since 1967, what do you today think of your father's plan, knowing what you know about what those intervening 50 years have brought to Palestine?
Well, thank you for this question. It's a very important question. And I would start by saying that the beginning of the occupation in June 7, 1967 marked a fundamental change in my father. He was no longer apathetic about politics as he had become in the late 50s when he lived under Jordan's rule. He somehow found renewed energy and again applied himself wholeheartedly to political work, which he had left after his incarceration in the desert prison in 1957. It was only a few weeks after the beginning of the Israeli occupation that he submitted his proposal to for the establishment of the Palestinian state next to Israel along the 47 partition borders, with its capital in Arab section of Jerusalem, as well as holding negotiations over all other outstanding issues. So this was the plan. A Palestinian state alongside Israel, along the 47 borders, partition borders, and Jerusalem, the Arab section of Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestinian state. And then holding negotiations over all other outstanding issues. He was able to get the support for his plan from 50 prominent Palestinian leaders in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And he submitted the plan to two Israeli emissaries to present to the Israeli government. And they waited for a response, which he never got, of course. The plan reflected the conclusions he had arrived at after working on the Palestinian issue for 19 years. And the assumptions are very important, I think, on which he based his plan. The first assumption was that getting recognition for a Palestinian state was of paramount importance. In all his work before, he had realized that he was at a disadvantage, or the Palestinians were at a disadvantage, because they were not a state, and Israel was a state. So Palestinians had to get recognition as a state in order to be able to proceed and further their rights and their claims. The second assumption was that Israel cannot be defeated and obliterated through armed struggle. He said that Israel is part of the UN, and no country in the world, not even the Soviet Union, would accept for Israel to cease to exist. So what's the point of armed struggle when it was not going to end in the defeat of Israel? And he also argued, and it was very prescient of him to think in this way, that time was in Israel's favor, because Israel was the party which had the control over the territory. And as a party on control over a territory, it could do anything. And of course it did. It started building settlements right from the very beginning. 2 months after the occupation, it began building settlements. And as we know today, the settlements are all over the place, and they've taken most of the land in the West Bank. He also realized that another assumption was that mutual recognition and peace serves both sides. And he was adamant about this, that peace will serve both sides and will bring prosperity to the whole region. And that without peace, violence would proliferate. So these were his assumptions, and all of these proved correct in the long term. Now, unfortunately, Israel was euphoric after the victory, and only had increased its appetite for expanding the state by taking over the occupied territories. And they began to do this from the very beginning, trying to take over as much of the occupied territories as they could. They started with Jerusalem, annexing Jerusalem by June, 3 weeks after the Israeli occupation. In June, they annexed East Jerusalem and made it part of Israel. They didn't annex the West Bank, they annexed East Jerusalem. And then they started building more and more settlements. Now, the Palestinians outside were determined to take the initiative in their own hands and fight Israel. And they had left the Naserites' Arab nationalism, and it turned into Palestinian nationalism. And there was excitement and support for Palestinian nationalism and for the armed struggle. And so they didn't want the proposal that my father put forward. And now, interestingly enough, amongst his papers, I found an article which was entitled "History Repeats Itself." And it was written on 26 November 1970. And in it, my father spoke about the Israeli tactic of doing exactly what they did in Palestine after 1948, which is to create facts, and to create facts by building Jewish settlements, which will render the establishment of the Palestinian state impossible. And this, of course, was what they did. And now a Palestinian state alongside Israel remains the PLO's objective, but alas, it's an unattainable objective, because most of the land had been taken by Israel through settlements, through creating facts, which he spoke about in 1970. So he knew what was going to happen. He was prescient, and I think that his plan was an excellent plan, but I can also see why it was impossible for it to succeed, given the atmosphere that prevailed at the time. So this is my response to your question. I'd like to ask you about the last chapter in your book, which is a conversation with Jack Persikian, who is an artist and a curator and gallery owner. You finish by giving him a page or so where he explains how important art is for Palestinian life in Jerusalem. It's a beautiful passage. Can you read that section out for us?
Absolutely, yes, I can. Jack, just to give a little introduction, Jack is an amazing person. He's a gallery owner. He's a curator. He's an artist himself. He's had many positions internationally. And he's for the last more than 20 years, 25 years, he's sort of developed as a kind of a spokesperson for Palestinian contemporary art. He's supported art across Palestinian society, both within Palestine and outside. He's an amazing person, and he still is dedicated to Jerusalem. He still has a gallery, which was his father's premises in the old city of Jerusalem. And he works there, and he supports an art foundation there as well. I've talked to him many times. He's always a fascinating person to talk to. This was a particularly evocative passage, which I reproduced in the book. It's like I say, it's about a page. It's probably 2 or 3 minutes long. I'm just going to get all his words. This is all his words. This is not me speaking. This is Jack Bersekian. Jerusalem is becoming a mere symbol only, a religious symbol, a symbol of God and religion and nothing more, a token capital of Palestine. Holiness empties the city out because the holiness of the symbol becomes far more important than the living population. There's a whole generation of Palestinians, even two, who don't know what Jerusalem looks like. They see it in pictures, but it doesn't mean a thing. It's very disturbing. Jerusalem is becoming less and less of a place where you can see people living, enjoying their life, creating a future for the younger generation. De-symbolizing Jerusalem comes through education. That's what art is trying to do, to make people think outside these prescribed narratives, look at things from different ways, express ideas and thoughts and feelings. It's about liberating yourself. Once more individuals are liberated from within, you can eventually start to evolve a society that is on its way to freedom. Otherwise, you can talk about freedom and liberation from here to Timbuktu. But if the people are shackled with all the baggage of religion and taboos and dominion by these bankrupt political parties, then it won't mean anything. I personally believe that we need to keep looking for ways to grow and build more of a base. It can happen. Art can liberate. Yes, the people of Jerusalem are on their way to freedom and liberation, but there's a huge obstacle, and that is finding means and possibilities for those people who are gradually realizing their potential. They're hitting up against finding a job, affording the city decent living conditions, being able to manage with all the complex maze of laws and regulations the Israeli government imposes in order to live as a Palestinian in Jerusalem. People see no possibility for growth here. Even if you're brilliant, a creator, if you've just invented something, or you're an industrialist and you want to open a factory, you can't do it in Jerusalem. You will have to go into the West Bank, or you will leave the country. It's a catch-22. People who I've seen manage to liberate themselves and gain that potential opt to leave Jerusalem and make their lives abroad. Those who stay here, a good number of them are stuck, hopeless, helpless, desperate, depressed. One keeps trying and keeps working, but you're pushing against a huge wall. We've managed to keep a voice coming out from Jerusalem in art, in all the circles that art revolves in, locally and internationally. The voice insists that Jerusalem, with all its historical and religious baggage, has a contemporary art identity and is engaging multiple issues through the lens of art and the work of artists. It's saying that Jerusalem is worthy of attention. Unquote.
Beautiful.
It is beautiful. Jack is an extraordinary speaker.
Yeah.
It was amazing to talk to him. That passage ends my book. I'm now going to link to another question to you. There's an epilogue after that, but that's the end of the final chapter of my book. At the end of your book, you write that your father says the only real victory is when we've both won. You've hinted at that already, but what did he mean by that? And also, do you agree with it?
Well, I agree with it because our situation in Palestine, Israel now is the antithesis of what father had hoped for when he said peace will be achieved when we both won. And this is because winning, one side is winning very strongly and the other side is losing very strongly. And it's now a zero-sum game. But maybe the best thing to do to explain what my father meant is to read from the last part of the book, where we have an imaginary dialogue between us. And here is how it goes. Now, over half a century later, with Israel in full control of the Palestinian population living in Israel itself and in occupied territories, I want to tell my father that history may have proved him wrong, that perhaps this was but an empty threat when he said that Israel will not be able to control the 1.2 million Palestinians when it is only 2 million and a half Israeli. And that this was an empty threat. The occupier has seemingly won. The word occupation has been dropped from Israel's vocabulary. The curriculum taught in their schools tells their students that the whole of Greater Israel is theirs and that the Palestinians have no rights over that land. I want to say to him, you underestimated Israel's power, resourcefulness, and long-term planning. The conversation is continuing, and my father answers me. Do you really believe it was inevitable that history should have taken that course and that it couldn't have been otherwise? Of course not. It was all a consequence of the two sides refusing to recognize each other's existence. It could have been otherwise. When I raised the prospect of violence ensuing if Israel did not pursue the course of peace, I knew it was an empty threat. I had no illusion about the capabilities of our people in the occupied territories who had been under the harsh regime of Jordan for 19 years and had nothing with which to fight Israel. Yet to Israel, the possibility that it might fail to control the over 1 million Palestinians who came under its control was a real cause for worry. You say that they've won, and you can cite the fact that they deny the Palestinians have any rights over the land and have dropped you out of their consciousness. This is only because it only means that they've succeeded in deceiving you as well. You think that because they've made you invisible, they've won. It pains me to hear you put it like that. This is a recipe for perpetual war. Don't you realize that the only victory is the achievement of peace between our two peoples? How it saddens me to see that the only relations between you and you are those of master and slave, one of exploitation, hatred, seizing every opportunity to destroy each other. And yet you call their denial of Palestinians their victory. Just think how much Israel has wasted learning the tricks of interrogation, repression, and other coercive ways to control the Palestinian population under their rule. Of course, they had the best masters to teach them, the English, who left them with their brutal methods of torture, house demolitions, and deportations, all enshrined in laws such as the Defense Emergency Regulation, which Israel found ready and used extensively over the years. And I reply, and then he says, has any of this brought peace any closer? And I reply, of course not. Yet still, the fact is that they won. To them, it's a war to destroy the Palestinians, deny their existence and rights to the land. And they did it. They won. And that's all that matters to them. As to the cost, it was much higher, much higher for us than for them. Nothing to compare. They lost thousands of soldiers. We lost many more and still remain stateless. Then he tells me the cost that they bore goes far beyond the number of dead in the course of numerous wars they waged. Loss of life was only part of it. How much better things would have turned out had they used their superior skills and resources to help develop the region rather than continually destroying it. That's their choice, I say. A choice they made because they won. And he says, the only real victory is when we both won.
That's very poignant. Thank you very much indeed for that. I'm watching the clock. It looks like our time is up. So I'm going to say thank you very, very much indeed to Raja Shehadeh, whose book We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I, is out now. Thank you, Raja.
And thank you, Matthew.
Thank you very much indeed as well. I'm Matthew Teller. My book is Nine Quarters of Jerusalem. It's also out now. And as I said, you'll find links to buy both books posted below this video. So on behalf of the Bristol Festival of Ideas, thank you very much indeed for watching.